structure. See, you notice that, Moses, remember one of his arguments at the burning bush was, who am I supposed to say sent me? Who am I supposed to tell the Israelites? And what did God say? Not this God that you worship, not this God that you believed in. The God that spoke to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, Israel, that spoke to them. There was it up until the next few years. There was basically, the relationship with God and the humanity, the God of, the Israelites, was he would speak to a specific person and they would do a deed. And he wasn't really seen as being involved in their life. Yes, he created creation, but after, Adam and Eve sinned and were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, there was like the separation. Every once in a while, God would speak to somebody and something would happen. But there wasn't this consistent worship or there was relationship, or what did that mean? So for the Israelites, what would become the most important structure that they needed in their society was the religious society of how do we relate to God? How does God relate to us? What does he expect? So their patriarchs really didn't have written traditions or even oral traditions or guidance on, how to form this or how to do any of this. So think about that for a minute. Overnight, literally overnight, one night, you and around 1.5 million of your friends and family go from being slaves to you're free. And now you're supposed to be a nation. Big task. So they had to learn some lessons. And God, again, didn't just free them and say, okay, go off, go north, go establish that land, call me when you get there. God was still intimately involved in their life. So in order to avoid chaos, they needed national structures established. And today we'll start to see some of these structures that the Israelites had to form. And again, this didn't come because of, they had great philosophical writers or they had committee meetings. A lot of these were God-given. God said, you need to do this and you need to form this, and this is the way to behave. This is the way to act. And so these structures were established. The first lesson that they had to learn is chapter 18, that one person can't do it all. One leader's not enough. That we remember that Moses, when in his midlife, he tried to bring justice to the Israelites on his own power. He ended up murdering an Egyptian that was oppressing an Israelite. And the Israelite called him out. Pharaoh put a death sentence on him. He ran, and he ended up in the desert of Midian. He met Jethro and ended up marrying into Jethro's family and living with him for 40 years as a keeper of Jethro. Now, Jethro was a priest. And remember that we talked a few months ago that a lot of times when we refer to call somebody a priest, it's not just he's a religious leader, but he's a political leader of a large family group. Again, there wasn't really individual nations. You had like kingdoms. Again, the Egyptian kingdom. You would have, to the northeast, you would have some of the Asiatic kingdoms that we see during this time. There wasn't like, they didn't call themselves the nation of Egypt or the nation of Syria. And so Jethro was the head family. He was the religious leader. He was the family leader. He was the political leader, the economic, the military, and of a pretty large family group. He brought his daughter and his grandsons to Moses because Moses probably, even though it says earlier in the Bible, he brought his wife and sons with him to Egypt. I think as the pressure went on, again, the Bible doesn't give us some of these details, but this is me thinking, I think Moses said, Pharaoh is not happy with me. He may, jail my sons. He may put them to death as blackmail. May do the same thing for my wife. So maybe he sent his wife and his children back north to his father-in-law for safety. So now Moses worked through his God. He has, led the people out of slavery. So Jethro brings his family to him to be reunited. So he's very honored. And you notice they have a great feast for them. And then Jethro kind of spends a few days, maybe even a few weeks. We don't really know, just some time. And he looks around, and Moses gets up the next morning after this great feast, and he goes and sits, and 1.6 billion people line up to bring him their problems. From the thing of my next door neighbor drove his tent, moved my tent peg and collapsed my tent to put his up. Or this guy over here, took one of my goats out of my herd and slaughtered it and, feasted on it last night. Or this guy over here, keeps making side eyes towards my daughter, and I don't like that. I'm not letting him marry him. To maybe this person, robbed this person, or maybe there was a murder committed. We're not really told, but Moses literally from sun up to sundown, everybody came to him with his problems. Now, in a way, we could be a little envious of that, could we? We think of our modern time. How easy is it, even with the internet, to contact our political leaders, even our local leaders? How many times, and I do that through some of the different organizations I belong to. I'll send them an email saying, hey, I think you should support this bill or not support this bill. And you get that little canned email. Thank you very much for your. Even sometimes when you call, you end up with an aide who says, okay, well, thank you for your opinion. I'll mark it down. And literally what they do is, okay, 100 people today called about issue whatever, and 50 were for this, 50 were this, 51 said this. So, maybe, we should lean towards 51. That's politics. Think about it. 1.6 million people every day. Even let's say 1%. 1,600 people a day are coming you, Moses, with their problems for you to solve. Jethro looked at that and said, one, it's going to burn you out, Moses. Two, the people are going to get frustrated. Our leader, Moses, there's no justice. There's no guidance. Let's just go do what we want, and you would see a fracture. So Jethro says there in verses 13 through 22, here's a solution. Moses, you've got the leaders. Because again, remember that the Israelites are descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, of Israel. They developed into what we call tribes. Each one of the tribes, a subgroup of the nation of Israel, identified by we are descendants of Dan, or we are descendants of Judah. So if you go back and reference that, you will see it's talking about those were the names. So it would be very much like back in 1776, we eventually called ourselves the colonies, the former colonies in rebellion against Egypt. But subgroup, we called ourselves New Yorkers. We called ourselves New Hampshireans. We called ourselves Pennsylvanians. So even though we had a national identity, we also had a sub-identity. So this is what it was. And eventually when the Israelites enter into the promised land, that each tribe would be given a specific area to go conquer, to live it. And that would become, in essence, today in our monoculture, that would become a province. It would become a state of the nation of Israel. So Jethro says you got at least 12 heads of each of these families, and actually 13, because the Joseph, because he was more Egyptian than he was an Israelite at the end of his life, that his two sons became, you never see the tribe of Joseph, you see the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh. They are the sons of Joseph, and they were called, in essence, sub-tribes. So you realistically had 13 tribes, but actually 12 tribes, but two of them were kind of like North and South Carolina. They're Carolinians. I know if you're from Carolina, I apologize. Mouthy Yankee, I know. But they're still Carolinians, or whatever you call yourselves. But some of them live in the north, some of them live south. Okay, we'll pick on South Dakota. Same thing. Well, the Dakota, South Dakota, same thing. You had the tribe of Joseph, but they kind of faded away because over time, well, Joseph, kind of, adapted himself to the Egyptian culture. And do we know if he worshipped the Egyptian gods? Blah, blah, blah. He was kind of a foreigner. He lived more in a foreign land than he did, in the family group. So Jacob, for whatever reason, divided. He blessed the two grandsons as his children. So you have, going back to that, Jethro says, you got these 13 guys, family heads. Why can't the people of Dan go to the the family head, go to him? If he can't handle it, then they go to you, Moses, because you're talking to God. You're doing this. You are the leader, but you don't have time to deal with whose goats whose. And then what would happen is the men in charge of each of those groups would go, again, divide. Let's say they're all equal, which they weren't. Some tribes were bigger than others. Divide 12 into 1.6 million. That you still, one guy dealing with hundreds of thousands of people. So what would happen is that leader would then look and say, this is kind of much for me. So boiled it down even farther. So then kind of how you would have a structure how we have today. If we have a problem, we want, this issue, those of us who live in the village of Odessa, we would go to the village council. And we would go to the mayor. And if the issue wasn't solved or to our liking, and maybe the village says, well, that's beyond our scope, we would go to the county level, to our county legislatures. And maybe they would agree with us, but say, we don't have the power. Then we would go to the state of New York. Then we would go to the federal government. Very much the same thing. This is what the early nationhood, was developing here. So that was the first thing. They had to realize that, they were not the nation of Moses. They were the Israelites. Though they were united, one person couldn't do it all. That they had to solve their minor problems, and if they couldn't come up with the idea, then they would go on. And we would see this. This happens throughout the rest of the Israelites' history. So the second lesson they had to learn is they had to develop a core, an identity. Who are we as Israelites? Because again, your identity a few months before this was that you were slaves. You were descendants of Jacob and Isaac and Abraham, who came to Egypt because one of Israel's sons was a slave. He was risen up to the second power of Egypt, and you were saved from the famine. But then things changed, and for 480 years plus, you were slaves, and all of a sudden, one night, your slave masters kicked you out, and you're now in the desert, and you're supposed to be a nation. Think of the mentality change. It would be like taking 1.6 million people right here in our area, picking them up overnight, and saying, you're now going to live in central Russia, but you're going to be your own nation. This area here is yours. Go. Imagine the chaos. Those of us who are old enough to maybe remember, back in the 1990s, there was a horrific civil war in the Balkan area of Europe. What had happened for about 50 to 60 years, they lived under first the oppression of the German Nazi government, and then they lived under the oppression of communism, ultimately ruled by the Soviet Union. And these people still had ethnic division, they still had religious division. They had memories back thousands of years, not liking my next door neighbor simply because of the religion they practiced, their last name, their accent, whatever. But what held them together was, the communist government for the majority of the time saying, we don't care, get along, or else everybody's going to get wiped off the face here. But then when communism fell, instead of the people going, all right, we didn't like the communists, they're gone now. Now we are free from that. Form a nation. It was, yeah, let's form a nation. I'm going to be, our people group is going to be the nation. Nope, my people group's going to be the nation, and so on. And we had this awful civil war of ethnic cleansing. That this was the same thing. If the Israelites didn't form a core identity of who they were, that you could have the tribe of Judah. Well, we're the largest, we're the powerful because we were the oldest son, and we're going to rule over you guys. And you could have, the tribe of, let's say Dan say, oh, no, you're not, that we're going to rule over and we're going to do this. And then you would have, these two little smaller tribes of Benjamin and the sub-tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Oh, those are the small guys. Let's go let's pick on them. Let's steal their resources and, let's make them slaves. You could see the chaos that would develop. So they had to have a core of their nationhood that they all agreed on. Chapter 19. Now, how they did it, they didn't pick up arms in 1776 and fight their overlords. They had God come down and say, this is who you are. This is who I promised Abraham when I called him out and said, go to a land you don't know, to a people you don't know, and possess a land you know nothing of. This is who you are. You are my people, and this is who you need to be. So what would happen is the very original format of the Israel nation was a human leader who did two things. One, did the government end of things, but also he represented God in front of the people. Not that like Pharaoh, who saw himself to be God, that this person was so in tune with the ways of God that he represented the holy God to the people and said, this is how we were to live. So this is what Moses' rule was. What this became is, and this is to some historians and some students of political science are about to hate this word. Israel became a theocracy. And what a theocracy means is a nation driven by the relationship with God. Now, in our own Constitution, we see references to God. And we say we were founded on Christian principles. But we were never a theocracy. We didn't all get together and pray and vote a leader in. We pray about our votes. But we vote. What Israel was God was the head of the government. And then he chose a human being to be his representative. And every law, every social custom, every way you spend your money, every way you relate to the nations around you were guided by your religious principles. So after 3 months, of walking through the desert, the Israelites come to Mount Sinai. And keep in mind, again, we skip over some of these words. We read the words, we go, okay, cool. They were there for at least a year, because the Bible literally says that after this time, that they're camped around this mountain in Sinai, they celebrated the second Passover. So to me, you celebrate one Passover and then you celebrate a second one at the same time of year. That's a year. In their calendar, about 13 months. So it took them a year to do all this. That here was the unique thing. Remember I talked about how God was a voice to certain people individually, and those people, like Noah, went and did an act, built an ark. That Abraham did an act. He left his family. He went to the land where he was. Israel went down into Egypt because God had placed his son in a place of rescue for his family. Now, you're camped around this mountain, and all of a sudden, the glory of God hovers above this mountain. Now, they already had exposure to some of God's glory. Remember, the angel of the Lord. I've never seen an angel, but I'm pretty sure if I saw an angel walking in front of me, flying in front of me, I don't know what it meant, but going before me with this pillar of fire, not burning anything, but this pillar of fire coming down the sky and this massive cloud following behind me, I think that this God that my ancestors talked about was pretty true. But then to even instill the point more, they're camped around this mountain, and all of a sudden, God's glory comes down. Read in, later on, go into the book of Isaiah, go into into Revelation and the few middle chapters, from the middle chapters on. God's glory, his holiness, appears to the people. And then he calls their leader Moses to come and speak. God's no longer a voice individually to people. God's presence is seen. It tells the people, this is really true. This is really who we are. Not since Adam and Eve has God physically, one-on-one with humanity. Before, it's been a voice through, remember Abraham, through an illustration of Abraham and the burning pots where the covenant was fine, one last time proven point to Isaac or to Abraham of his blessing from God. The burning bush to Moses. But here, no matter where you are in the camp, you look up and you can see God's glory. God, all his power. It talk about fire and thunder and lightning. You can hear this. You can see this God that has been talked about for centuries. The words are true. So this becomes the core to these people. Let me read to you chapter 19, 3-6 here. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is already mine, you will be the kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. See, God set the parameters of the relationship. I chose you. Out of all the nations, for the last 1,000 years, I chose Abraham, the founder of your people. I chose him and all his descendants to be mine. And there was a time for 400 years that you were in slavery, but I rescued you from that slavery. It's pretty obvious that you're no longer slaves, and you saw the most powerful nation, this nation who said that their guy who sits on the kingdom controls all of nature, beat into the ground. That I blessed you, and I will continue to bless you. And I will establish you as a nation among all other nations. But all you have to do is honor and obey my commandments. That's all you have to do. If you want to be blessed by God, honor and obey him. You can bring all the sacrifices you want. You can, wear all the right garments. You can say all the right words. You can, memorize the whole of Holy Scripture, but if you don't obey them and honor God, you won't be blessed for it. Kind of a subtle hint there from God. Who you are, calling yourself an Israelite, calling yourself a Christian, calling yourself a Wesleyan, not going to get you to a relationship with God. They offer guidance. They offer words of wisdom. They offer, what is and what is not to have how and how not to have a relationship with God. But you got to do it. You've got to obey him and you've got to honor him. Simple. There's a song we used to sing in Sunday school, I believe, and don't ask me to sing it. I can't even remember words, but it says over and over again, all you gotta do is obey and follow God. That's all you have to do. It's not that hard. We human beings make it hard because it seems a little too easy. Seems, well, I want to justify myself. I want to make myself look really good. So I'm going to go to church every Sunday and I'm going to wear a suit and a tie. I'm not going to have this and I'm not going to do this and I'm not going to go near these people. And God's going to see me and everybody else is really, really holy. But if in your heart of hearts you don't honor and obey God, you haven't done anything. That if you honor and obey God, God will bless you. So this is the dependent core of Israelites' duty. That God did all this, his grace, this word isn't used in the Old Testament, but this will become a New Testament term. This grace that God gave us. You sinned against me. You want to trace your history? You trace it to Abraham. Great. Trace it all the way back to the Garden of Eden. You want to talk about your patriarchs? Yeah, your patriarchs, your great grandfather, grandmother were walking and talking all the time with me in my very presence. This holy presence you see on this mountain, they were there and they didn't obey me or honor me. They were sinful. You want to talk about family history? Oh, you forgot about the Adam and Eve thing. You want to talk about Abraham, the great guy who, packed up the possessions and walked around in the desert and looked around, and other kings and other priests came to him and said, hey, let me give you a tribute. That's who we are. You ever do that? Well, I'm a descendant of so-and-so. I'm not going to mention the guy who was a bank robber or, my grandmother who, never was married, but, had an awful lot of guys living with her. I'm not going to mention that, my family history. I'm going to mention that, I'm a 14th, cousin twice removed of a pilgrim that came to Earth, came to, Plymouth Rock and, was a founder of this country. I'm not going to mention, the guy, who, was brought here in chains as a prisoner because he was a mass murderer and England wanted to get rid of him. So they sent him over here and, he was kind of a nasty, drunken guy. We don't mention those things in our family history, do we? We talk about the good things. This is where the Israelites, God said, I didn't have to choose you. I didn't have to choose anybody because my creation turned its back on me. But my grace and my love for my children, each and every one of us, is so much, I want you to have a relationship with me. So it's nothing you Israelites have done that brought that. But you want to keep that relationship? Honor and follow me. So eventually Israelites would rise to become a great and powerful nation. And I talked about last week, every time from this point on, I'm going to, instill this fact. Every time they fell into political, economic, social, and especially religious chaos was when they failed to honor and obey God. Same thing in our own life. That I'm not saying that, everything that happens to us is because we don't honor and obey God. But if we want the great blessings of God, that's the very first thing we need to examine our life. That when we come to challenges, are we honor and obey God? How do I honor and obey God? Through the challenges of my life. So, in return, that holy God, that thunder, that lightning, that fire, that voice that you see will have a relationship with you. That God who humbled the Egyptians will continue to be your God. All you have to do is honor and obey him. So, verses 16 through 19 there. So, God's presence became obvious to these people. They realized when they compared their lives to the holiness of God that they were fearful. They didn't want to go near God. God, I believe, original intention was for those people to gather closely around that mountain and listen to what we'll examine next. But the people were fearful because the people saw the holiness of God and looked at their life and said, I can't go near him. I can't. I want a separation. So they told Moses, you be our representative to God. And that's what would develop through the next thousands of years and the religious history of the Israelites. God wanted them to come near him. God wanted them an intimate relationship. We talked about the whole theme of this journey through the Bible. God wants a relationship with you. But because when we get closer to the holiness of God, we go, who am I to God? That's the right thinking. Who are you compared to God? But God says, you're nothing. But come close to me and I will make you something. It's nothing you can do. It's all dependent on me. But we human beings see that instead of just taking that simple thing, honor and obey, and have a close relationship with God, we put it in a bridge. You got to do this and this and this. You got to be this, this, and this. You got to say this and this. You got to, the people who go to school for, 4, 6, 8 years and have these special degrees, those are the ones that talk to my God, and then they tell me what to say. That's not how God started the relationship. That each and every one of us has the right, through God's grace, to go directly to him, as long as we honor and obey him. But the people would start, and this would be the problem. Because if you're going to depend on another human being to go to you to God, that person better have a stronger relationship to God than you do. That person better really be communicating you the truth and not what they want. And that will become a problem throughout the Israelites' history, is they set up, not God, they set up this separation, this wall. God, you stay here, I go here. We kind of, we have a guy standing on top of the wall. Yep, okay, he said this. Yep, said this. That's not what God said. That's not what God's purpose was. And we'll see when we get to the New Testament how that got destroyed. And how God came to his people, not just in his power and his glory and his thunder and lightning, but came as one of us and said, here's my hand, take it. Come to me. Point what you see in the second book of the Bible, the Old Testament. There's a connection to the New Testament. And if there's a connection from there to there, there's a connection from there to here. Keep that in mind. So the third lesson that they needed to learn is they needed a bill of responsibilities. How do we be Israelites? How do we have a relationship with God? And how do we have a relationship with each other? So verses 10 through 7, or moving on to chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. I invite you to read these later. I'm not going to take time because I'm trying to get through the stuff here I have because I want to cover it all today. We call these the 10 Commandments. Now, again, don't take the Hollywood version of Moses climbing up the mountain and, God speaking to us. That did happen. But this is Pastor Brian talking, I believe as God was talking these directives to Moses was a scribe, he was writing them down. The people heard it. The people from those camped closest to the mountain to the farthest away, I believe they heard the voice of God. So this wasn't Moses coming down for the 10 Commandments, the two big tablets in his hand said, hey, got what God said here. I believe the people heard God speaking. And we'll see next week, they heard the voice of God, saw the voice of glory. It's not always that easy to kind of stay true to who you are. So what the 10 Commandments were is a bill of responsibilities. We in America have the Constitution. The Constitution is the last authority, the first and last authority of every law, from the parking ordinances in the village of Odessa to the sentencing guidelines of somebody who, committed mass murder to whatever. The Constitution, and I'm not being political, read the founders, that the intention was that the words in there and then any amendments, that was it. Every law that you write, every court case is judged. This is the core of American social judicial life. Every law that's written, every judge, their decisions is supposed to be based on the Constitution. Every jury that sends down a verdict, it's the Constitution that guides them. So these 10 Commandments, that was the intention. That everything from this point on as a nation, they were intended, before they wrote any laws, before they had any customs established, they were to look at the 10 Commandments. Does this match it? If not, they weren't to do it. If they were to do it. Remember, I said a bunch of times already, honor and obey God. How do I honor and obey God? He gives them a list of 10 things, 10 very core things to do or not to do. So, but he starts off there. And actually, you know what? This is such a core thing. I'm going to pause. And we're going to hit this next week because I don't want to rush this. So, what I want you to do this week is, there's my alarm. That's Pastor Brian's alarm to be quiet. I just got to shut it off. Sorry. So next week, read chapter 20. And then the preceding, if you want, continue to read some of the following chapters, but don't get caught up in a lot of that. We'll explain why those there. But this week, chapter 20, just read that a few times. It's 26 verses. So in your time with God, each day, just read those and reflect on them. And we'll go in a little bit and we'll tear them apart a little bit more next week and why these core essentials are. So we're going to stop there because, again, I don't want to rush this. I want to, build this out. So let's close in prayer this morning, and then next week we'll pick right back up where we left off here. Heavenly Father, we thank you that living for you is so simple. To honor, obey, and love you. no matter if it's in the grocery store, our workplace, the privacy of our homes, our churches, our daily walks, talking on the phone to family, to friends, what we're doing on social media, the books we read, who we are, how we pray, reading your word. You want a relationship with us, and you have shown us how to have that relationship. But we confess that sometimes when the rubber meets the road, that honoring you, that obeying you, that loving you seems difficult, seems uncomfortable, doesn't seem what everybody else is doing. But Lord, that's the way you want us to live. Give us just a little bit of faith to step up, to accept that invitation. Show us how to love you. Show us how to honor you. Show us how to obey you. In your name, amen. All right, folks, you have a good week, and we'll see you next week.